All right, everybody, we're going to get started here in just a second. All right, let's get started. So this is the webinar, The 3 Legal Traps for Online Businesses. I'm Brock Shinen. I'm going to switch over. How you doing, everybody? So my name's Brock Shinen. I'm very excited to do this webinar with you today. Online businesses. And I am an attorney. I work with online businesses all the time. I'm going to get into that in a little bit, but I want to start by pointing out a couple of technical aspects of the webinar, get you comfortable for what we're doing here. You'll notice that there's a chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. Anytime you could use that to communicate with me, to respond to different questions, or to ask your own questions. Now, one thing as I go through the webinar, I may not be able to get back to you if you post a question in the chat box during the webinar, but I'll do my best to kind of track it. But there's definitely going to be Q&A time towards the end, so we'll get into the questions there. The other thing, if you're having any difficulties with audio or video quality, go ahead and try refreshing the browser screen. And if that doesn't work, go ahead and log out of the webinar and then log back in, and that should take care of any of the issues that you do have. Now, I want to jump straight into the content. I want to provide you with a lot of value today. So let me start just briefly telling you about myself. As I mentioned, I'm an attorney. I'm licensed in the state of California. A lot of my time spent is devoted to helping online businesses, and they're navigating all kinds of different issues. And one of the things I want to do today, and why I wanted to do this webinar for you, is because I've identified these traps, these legal areas where online businesses are neglecting, they're failing to address, and problems. It can, in the worst circumstances, it can actually put a business, an online business, out of business. But you know, by and large, what we're dealing with is keeping more money in your pocket. And as an online business, who wouldn't want to do that? You want to keep more money in your pocket. So we're going to help mitigate that expense of dealing with legal issues, but we're also going to help mitigate potential liability. Now, when it comes to liability, depending on the type of liability, there are some that could be thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars. So it really depends on the type of liability we're talking about, but that's something we want to address here. And online businesses, in some ways, are particularly subject to those types of risks because we tend to operate, you know, on the cusp. We're ahead of the curve of technology. And many times we're operating just as quick as we can, and so we neglect some of the meaningful things that we need to. So I want to jump into this content. Last piece I want to give you, I am an attorney, as I mentioned, but this is not legal advice. I'm not your attorney until you engage me in writing, and I agree in writing. And I want to point that out because sometimes people will say, well, hey, you're an attorney, and I asked you a question during the webinar, and you answered me, so I relied on that as legal advice. You shouldn't. This is general information. Just because of my experience, yes, I could choose. But if we really want to get into the specifics of your circumstances, you need to hire an attorney. And if that's me, great, but you need to reach out to me separately. So otherwise, for this webinar and all the webinars that I do, this is information only. And if I do use examples, I may say, well, I had a client and they did this or that. Keep in mind that these are fictional clients based on experience. So these are not actual clients that I'm talking about. These are not actual circumstances. I'm pulling from information from working for years with different online businesses and trying to convey thoughts and stories to you to help you better understand the topic. So we're going to jump right in right now to the 3 legal traps for your online business. I want to start with some statistics. So I'm going to pull up a slide. You'll see me going back and forth. I don't want to bore you with just slides or just me. So I'm going to go back and forth a little bit. But we're going to jump into some slides right now. And I'll walk you through some statistics that I think will be very meaningful for you. All right, so we've talked about the topic here. We've talked about the technical issues. I do want to say I am going to talk to you about a live intensive. I'll go through that at the end of the webinar, and I'll explain what that is, but that is coming. Talked a little bit about myself. This is me, Brock Shinen, work with online businesses. We'll talk about part of what I deal with in online businesses is intellectual property, licensing, the CAN-SPAM Act, COPA, ownership, liability contracts, and much, much more. But let's jump into some statistics that you need to understand as you are an online business and you're facing these three legal traps. I made a quick disclaimer. We've talked about that. So here are some statistics that I think are important for you. According to the Small Business Administration, it says that there are more than 28 million small businesses in the US. Now that's a lot of small businesses. And a recent survey shows that 90% plus of those businesses have an online presence. Now actually that's not just small businesses, that's any type of business. And there are dozens of complicated laws that specifically apply to online business activities. And there can be legal landmines at every turn. So what do we do when we're faced with, we want to navigate the business, we want to navigate online business with trying to mitigate the risk? And looks like maybe these slides are not coming through, so. Okay, you should be getting, okay, sorry about that. So you should be getting, I don't know if you had a blank screen before that, but you should be seeing online business statistics. We talked about the million small businesses. We've talked about that there are 90% plus of businesses in general have an online presence, dozens of complicated laws. We've talked about legal landmines at every turn. So let's get into these three traps. What are they? The first trap is that you think you're not big enough to worry about legal problems. But let me give you a little dose of reality. The first is, oh, actually, before we do that, we're going to talk about all three, and then we're going to get into each one specifically. So the second trap for you is that you believe you don't have any assets, so they can't get anything from you. And we're talking about people that sue you, creditors, people that have lawsuits against you. You know, maybe you live in your mom's basement and you take public transportation and you don't own anything, so you think, well, hey, they can't get me. We're going to talk about that and why that's not true. The third one is that you're maybe thinking it's better to wait until you make real money before you worry about legal problems. And there's so many problems with that way of thinking as well, because the problems don't wait for you, as we'll see. So let's jump into the first one, and we're going to talk about these three are the big legal traps for your online business. You're not big enough to worry, you don't have any assets, so they can't get anything, and you want to wait until you make real money before you worry about legal problems. Let's start breaking these down one by one and why. So you're not big enough. Number one, according to US Census data, 60% of all businesses make less than $500,000 in revenue. Now this is critical because what it's showing you for context is that not only is there this vast number of small businesses, but most businesses make less than $500,000 a year. There's not a ton of money if you're talking about legal liability, because legal liability is expensive. So let's jump to this. According to the Small Business Administration, the vast majority of businesses are, quote, small businesses, meaning even if the average, above average, makes $500,000 in revenue, the vast majority of all businesses are small. So what this tells us is that most businesses are actually making less than $500,000 a year in revenue. And the third part, survey data will show us that small businesses spend in excess of $20 million each year in legal liability. Now think about that. We're talking about your average business making less than $500,000 a year. And we talked about earlier, you know, that there's something like 28 million small businesses. I mean, we're talking about close to just under $1 million on average that each of those businesses might be spending in liability. Now, of course, that's averaged out because some businesses might pay out $5 million in liability to play. There are different issues that come into play. But my point is, if you averaged it out, your average small business, despite the fact that it's making less than 500,000 in revenue, may be spending more, close to $1 million in liability. So this is a huge problem for online business. Fourth thing, estimates show that roughly 52% of all civil lawsuits target small businesses. Now, I'm guessing you didn't know that. I'm guessing that you think, hey, we're kind of small, they don't really care, no one wants to target us. Well, this is more than half of all civil lawsuits targeting small businesses. Now, I'm drawing some assumptions here. If you're an online business, it doesn't mean that you're automatically a small business. But since the vast majority of small businesses, or excuse me, of online businesses are small, then we could assume that at least half, more than half of all lawsuits are targeting businesses just like yours. So when you're thinking about, well, hey, I'm not big enough to worry about legal problems, I think you could start to see the picture that you actually have a lot to be worried about. So let's add one more data point here, that the survey shows that over 75% of all small businesses, business owners are worried about a frivolous or an unfair lawsuit. Now this is critical. I want to focus in on the frivolous or unfair part. See, it doesn't say, and the data didn't show, that most small businesses are worried just randomly about getting sued for things that they know they've done wrong. They're actually mostly worried about frivolous or unfair lawsuits. Lawsuits maybe by a larger competitor, or lawsuits where somebody just got angry at them and they just want to shut them down. So when you're thinking about, are your problems big enough, you have to consider, we're going to get back on screen real quick. So you have to consider that regardless of the size of your business, if you're an online business, you have a lot to be concerned about when it comes to legal problems. There are people out there, there are plaintiffs and there are plaintiffs' attorneys that specifically target small businesses. They specifically target online businesses. And most of us as online business owners, small business owners, most of us are actually concerned about unfair or frivolous lawsuits. So there's a lot to be concerned about here. And if you disregard the idea, the concept of legal issues, because you think, well, we're not big enough to worry about these problems, you can see from the data, and this is data from the federal government, the US Census Bureau, the Small Business Administration, we can see that there's actually a lot to be concerned about. So let's jump back to some of the slides again, and we're going to go through the next point. Okay, so we talked about you're not big enough, don't have any assets. So how many of you are saying, hey, I make decent money in my business, but I don't, I'm renting my house, I don't have a yacht, I don't have a vacation home on the beach or in the mountains, and you start creating this picture that because you don't have these assets, you somehow think that if somebody does sue you, they're not going to be able to get anything. Now, granted, on this particular topic, we're looking at part of the fundamental flaw in this way of thinking is not just about whether or not you have assets. It's also about characterizing your risk from the perspective of somebody suing you and getting a judgment. Because there's plenty of other risk involved, legal risk in particular, when it comes to operating your online business. So let's talk about, you don't have any assets, so they can't get anything from you. Let's destroy that myth right now. So assets are only one thing that they can go after. What do we mean by that? So creditors can actually go after your property or your wages. Now, we know a lot of online business owners actually work a full-time job, or they work 2 jobs. They work a normal paying job, and then they do this on the side. Not all of us, but many of us have a wage income from another job, and creditors can go after that. So many of us as online business owners don't realize, wait a second, it's not just about own, they can actually go after my wages. And that's not just in the context of a second job. That's even within the online business that you operate. So they can go after that. The other thing is that many states, and in fact, I think most states allow creditors to sit on a judgment for many years. So if they win a judgment against you today in 2016, and you don't have any assets, I mean, think about it. Sit back and really analyze, do you want to be in the same place that you are currently in your business, financially or otherwise, in 5 years, or do you want to grow? And my guess is that you want to grow. So really what we're looking at is you want to develop your business, you want to make more money with your business, and 5 years after a lawsuit, you might be in a substantially different place as far as finances and assets, or 10 years, or 20 years. And the thing is that most states are going to allow a creditor to sit on that judgment. Maybe it's 10 years, and 10 years later, you finally break that business open and you're generating millions. And suddenly that creditor that had a $2 million judgment against you comes out of the woodwork and is able to enforce that judgment against you, and everything that you've worked hard for suddenly taken from you. So that's another thing to consider in terms of whether or not you have assets. And the other thing, the other piece of that is that most do a judgment, which means that let's say that it's a 10-year judgment, and we're coming up on the 10th year, you still aren't making money, but the creditor believes you're right around the corner from making money. So what they do is they go into court and request a renewal of that judgment. And maybe it gives them another 5 or 10 years. So the next thing you know, just when you think that judgment is about to run out, you turn the corner, your business explodes, you're making lots of money, and that creditor comes out of the woodwork again to take that money right out of your pocket. So the other thing, and I think this is really a big one for most online businesses to consider, is that your idea of being what we would call judgment proof, meaning you don't have anything, you don't own anything. It's usually a temporary situation. In fact, we want it to be a temporary situation, right? You don't want to live a life of being judgment proof, because what that means is you don't make any money and you don't own any property. If that's the case and you are judgment proof and you're relying on being judgment proof, really what you're saying to the world is, I don't ever want to make money. I don't ever want to grow this business. So the idea that you've told yourself, I don't have any assets, they can't get anything from me. Essentially what you're saying is, I don't ever want to grow. I don't want to make money in my business because I want to remain judgment proof. So let's go on. And that of it working against you having a successful business. In order to remain judgment proof, you have to essentially undermine your business. You have to essentially keep yourself from ever making any real money. It's the only way to be to continue being judgment proof. So finally, just remember that the creditors can typically go after bank accounts, houses, cars, motorcycles, inheritances, lottery winning, stocks. There's a lot that they can go after. So let me get back on screen here real quick. So I think it's really critical that as an online business owner, you consider that even if you don't have a lot of assets, that's not a basis, that shouldn't be a basis for you to disregard the legal issues that you can otherwise address by saying, well, I'm not big enough, which was the first one we talked about, so it's not, I shouldn't be worrying about it right now. And the second real big legal trap is, well, I don't have any assets. And again, that's a temporary situation. That's not what you want. It's counterintuitive to operate in a business. So let's jump into the third one, the third legal trap for you. I'm going to screen share again. Okay, we talked about assets. So let's get into this the third legal trap, and that is, it's better to wait until you make real dollars before you worry about legal problems. Now, this to me should be a no-brainer, but I'll tell you this, as an attorney, I see all the time with online businesses and business owners thinking, well, hey, I don't even make enough. So even if I'm not judgment proof, I just don't make enough to warrant the concern and the worry about legal problems. So let's jump into some of the issues there and why that's a horrible way to think. The first is, legal problems don't wait for you to have money. If somebody wants to sue you, they're not going to say, well, let's wait until you make some real money and then we'll sue you. They can sue you with $1 in your pocket or $1 million in your pocket. The legal problems don't wait. And the other part of this is that your legal risks are often so directed to your daily activities that you can't even consider any sort of connection between a delay in when your legal problems are going to exist and when you're going to be prepared for them, because your legal problems are essentially accumulating on a daily basis every day you operate your online business. So just remember, legal problems don't wait for you to have money. And also, it actually costs less to reduce your legal problems than it does to fight them. I often talk to clients that come in and they say, well, hey, I really want to sue this other business. They've done these things, and they kind of lay out their case. And then I say, well, and sometimes they say, well, $5, $10, $20,000, $50,000. And see, there's a cost-benefit analysis that goes into play when you're dealing with legal problems. And one of those is that to actually go into court, to have an attorney represent you in a basic civil litigation, meaning you're essentially litigating some issues in court about your business, you're usually going to spend in excess of $50,000, maybe up to $100,000. And if it goes to trial, you might actually spend $150,000 or more. I mean, I've been involved in cases in one way or another as a specialist on some particular issue or otherwise, where legal fees have actually ran into the millions of dollars. So it does depend on the types of issues involved. But my point is, even to get a most basic case up to the point of trial, you can reasonably expect to spend in excess of $50,000. Now, when you think about the cost of maybe forming a corporation, or the cost of insurance, or the cost of learning about the CAN-SPAM Act or something like that, when you add all of those costs up, really, it costs much less to comply with all of those things or learn all of those things so that you can actually navigate them well than it does to wind up in court on even one issue, 50,000 or more. So it definitely costs less to reduce your legal problems or mitigate your legal risk than it does to fight them in court. So let's continue. And by the way, on that one, it's actually not just about fighting it in court. Sometimes that's also about fighting it in a negotiation with somebody who's threatening you. And maybe they're threatening to take you to court. So oftentimes you're not just paying an attorney, but you're also potentially settling a case that hasn't even wound up in court, and you have to pay tens of thousands of dollars just to settle a case. And I've seen many of those situations. So you're reducing your legal problems by paying up front, something that may feel a lot, but you tend to save a lot of money doing it that way than fighting on the back end. So the next point I wanted to transition into is that reducing your legal risk actually saves you money. So imagine that you're dealing with copyright issues, and you invest the sufficient resources to adequately license copyrighted materials. Maybe they're images for your website, maybe they're videos that you want to use in your promotional campaigns, whatever it is. But by reducing the legal risk, by spending money on things like licensing, for example, you're actually going to save yourself a significant amount of money. Because when you do, if you fail to license, and you may pay $5,000, let's say, to settle an infringement claim for using a Getty image or an iStock photo image without permission. Now, paying to use that same image may have cost you $50 or $100. So you could see where reducing the legal risk by doing things properly can actually save you a lot of money. So we're going to jump into the next couple on this final legal trap. And this one is that one legal problem can actually become the reason you never make any real money. So remember when we said this legal trap, is that it's actually better to wait until you make real money before you worry about legal problems. The legal problem itself, your first lawsuit, your first claim for overtime wages by one of your employees, or a contractor that says you don't own the copyrights that you actually hired them to create. That one legal problem can actually destroy your ability to make real money so that you never can worry about paying for legal problems or reducing your risk. So one final point here, legal protection actually doesn't cost as much as you think. Now, granted, if we're talking about getting into court, let's switch off of here real quick. So if we're talking about going into court, we tend dollars range as far as paying an attorney. But the truth is it protecting yourself? And there's a wide variety of ways to protect yourself. And it starts with things like forming the proper legal entity, getting the right types of insurance, implementing the right intellectual property policies, licensing copyrights and trademarks properly, incoming and outgoing, dealing with the CAN-SPAM Act, dealing with Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, all of these other issues. It's actually less, it tends to be much less than if you wait until you're sued or you're in front of a judge or some sort of claim or threat is in front of you and you're trying to pay yourself your way out of it. So dealing with legal protection on the front end almost always will cost less than dealing with legal liability on the back end. So I think that's very critical for you as an online business owner to understand these three trap areas. These three legal traps are critical in whether or not your business can thrive and survive. So let's finish out. I want to change directions a little bit. I want to go through a couple more slides, change directions a little bit, and we're going to switch to where do you go? What can you do? So what do? You recognize, okay, look, Brock, I realize that I've been that exact person. Wait till I make some real money and then I'll worry. Or, hey, I don't have any assets, I'm judgment proof, they can't get anything from me anyways. Or it's just too early to worry about this just because I'm not big enough. My business isn't big enough to worry about it. I've convinced you that those ideas, those thoughts are actually what's undermining you. And here's an example I like to use with a lot of clients. And I think it may feel very visceral, very dramatic, but I think you can draw the connection and see the connection very quickly. And that is that imagine driving in a car, you're not wearing a seatbelt. You're driving 100 miles an hour, weaving in and out of traffic. While all of that's happening, you know, the windows are down, the wind's blowing, the music is blasting, you're not worried about whether or not you have your seatbelt on because you're enjoying the moment. Or maybe, you know, you're rushing to get to work and you just don't have time because you have to, you know, maybe put on your makeup or you have to text somebody. There's all these different risks. But the point is you're not wearing your seatbelt. Now, no one really cares about wearing their seatbelt until they get in a crash, right? So God forbid, you get in a horrible crash. Now, the difference between life and death can hinge on whether or not you were wearing your seatbelt, right? So it's just like that in legal issues. Go through your daily life of working in your business, managing this, dealing with that vendor, posting this type of content, and you know in the back of your mind, well, I probably should worry about the legal stuff, but you're really not worrying too much because you feel like, well, when the time's right, when the money's there, when I'm bigger, my business is bigger, I'll deal with it. But suddenly there's a lawsuit, suddenly there's a claim, suddenly somebody is injured or defamed, or they say that they were defamed, or you've unlawfully used some of their content, or you violated a statute that you weren't even aware existed. And all of a sudden you realize, I don't have a seatbelt on. And when that crash comes, the difference between whether your business is going to survive depends on whether you've taken steps to protect yourself. So what do? I don't want to be too dramatic, but that is the reality, and that's the reality I face as an attorney all the time. What can you do? Let's start talking about that. First thing is, you can learn about proper business forms and structures. You could procure the correct type of insurance coverage. You can learn about specific risk areas for your online business. And those would be things like the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, or the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, or CAN-SPAM, or unlawful business practices. Sorry, I just realized there's a typo in that slide. But unlawful business practices. There are many different specific risks to your online business. So the other one is you can actually create a game plan to address the risk. You can actually start thinking about not just identifying these areas, but what are we going to do? How's my online business going to navigate these areas? Well, how do you do it? So we know what you can do, but how are you going to do it? You need to start with the first step. And that first step is going to lead to the next step. And you're going to be taking one step at a time, right? And these steps are actually fairly easy when you have somebody that can actually help guide you. So I want to talk a little bit about that. And that's going to be my live intensive. So let's get back on screen here. I want to tell you about my live intensive. Okay, so in my practice, I realize that time and time again, I'm working with online business owners and really business owners in general, entrepreneurs, and realize they're running into the same kinds of problems because they're only coming when they need help. They're not coming sort of proactively, hey, how do I prepare for these things? They're coming after they're already in trouble and I need to bail them out. I need to help them figure out. So what I wanted to do with the Live Intensive was give online businesses the ability to sort of see the future in some respects, to see what the issues are, to see some of these primary areas present such a substantial risk to an online business that if you understood what those areas were. For example, if I said to you, hey, are you familiar with canned spam and what you could do with emails? Yeah, I would guess that the vast majority of you would say, sure, I understand that. But the reality is very few of you have actually taken the time to understand the law in this regard and how it applies to you. Things like, is it okay to just have an unsubscribe button in the bottom of your email? Is that enough? And one of the things we would talk about in the Live Intensive, for example, is how far do you need to go for it to be reasonable and for it to comply with? Because an unsubscribe button within your email that leads to a page that you then have to remember a password may be unreasonable. And I'm guessing that none of you or few of you have ever even thought about that, because you think, well, I know that I'm going after, my email list is only people that I have a business relationship with. And that's great. You might be able to check off one box on the act. But what about, have you included a physical address? Is your unsubscribe process easy? And is it meaningful? You know, all of these things come into play. But that's easy enough as a topic because many online business owners are at least familiar with the Canned Spam Act or what some of the rules are surrounding sending emails. What if we're dealing with issue within copyright law, a Digital Millennium Copyright Act issue? What if you get a threat, or if you get noticed that, hey, there's infringing content on your website? What are you now obligated to do? See, the deeper we go, the more you realize, wow, I might even be familiar with some of the topics or some of the mnemonics. I know what COPPA means or what it stands for. I know what DMCA stands for. But the reality is that's just scratching the surface, because most online business owners, and I say this with authority because I work with them every day. As an attorney, it's a significant part of my practice, so I understand that most of them really don't know much more than they might be able to define the general scope or the general area of a piece of law that applies. But once you scratch past that surface, you realize that it's difficult. You don't know the specific nuances of each of these areas. So one of the things my Live Intensive does is it takes about a dozen of those areas, talking about legal entity structures, sole proprietorships versus partnerships versus LLCs versus corporations, and the varieties of corporations, corporate types. We go through what are some of the pros and cons. Why would you need to consider one versus the other? We talk about insurance. Where do you even get insurance? How do you know what types of insurance to get? How do you know what questions to even ask? What do you need to do? We talk about the Canned Spam Act. We talk about some of the specific rules that apply to you, and not just the basics. We dig a little deeper and say, are you making it reasonable, for example, or easy for a person to unsubscribe? So we get into the actual mechanics of that area. We talk about the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, and actually we spend a lot of time on intellectual property in general, copyrights and trademarks, because I see that there's two parts for online businesses that we're typically dealing with. One is incoming intellectual property, where we may be using copyrights or trademarks, and that could be in the form, on the copyright side, of videos from other sources. Maybe we found something on YouTube and we want to use it and incorporate it into our content, and we think, well, hey, it's free up on YouTube, anyone can access it, what's the big deal? So we use it. What are the rules that apply for using somebody else's intellectual property? But that's only one side of the picture of intellectual property. What about the other side where you're actually creating it? What are the best practices as it relates to creating IP? If you're taking photographs, if you're creating images, if you're creating videos or audio training, and I see so much out there online. In fact, I have a course up on Udemy, and I was reading a thread that related to copyright and how some of the videos from Udemy. And I see all these comments and people are going back and forth. Oh, you can't do anything. Oh, you don't need a registration. Oh, yes, you do need a registration. It's people with very limited knowledge, in some cases, absolutely no knowledge of copyright law, feeding each other. And that's part of the community that you're a part of, right? Online businesses, many of us actually have courses on Udemy and other sites like that. We're dealing in content, educational in nature or otherwise. Many of us are coaches or authors, or we have consulting practices, or we sell physical products. There's a lot of discussion, that takes place online in a lot of these different forums, a lot of these different groups. And there's so much misinformation, it's actually mind-boggling. For me as an attorney, I could spend literally all day, every day, just correcting people's misunderstandings, the misinformation that's being circulated in these groups of your peers. So the Live Intensive is meant to basically baptize you in some key areas that affect your online business. Those areas I've been talking about, and there are more, where we're not just identifying them, because I don't want to just scare you into thinking, okay, well, now I know there's 20 different areas I need to consider, but I still don't know what to do. The Legal Intensive is actually going to give you a toolbox. Here is how you can address. You're just going to need an attorney. Sometimes there are self-help things, and actually one of the things we're going to talk about, I like to talk about in the intensive, is what about things like LegalZoom, services like LegalZoom, where it's not quite self-help because you're still outsourcing it, but what I would pay a lawyer $2,000 for, LegalZoom does for $200. I'm going to get into some of that, and not necessarily LegalZoom, but the businesses like LegalZoom that are rendering those types of services or selling those types of what you might call resources or solutions. I'm going to talk about the pros and cons as I see it of why you may or may not want to use those services, when it makes sense to talk to an attorney. So we're actually going to talk about actionable steps you can take in each of these areas. So that's the Live Intensive. I'm telling you about it now. I'm sort of selling it to you now, because here's what I want you to do in terms of the next steps. I'm going to switch back to some slides here real quick. We're going to kind of finish out and then walk into the Q&A portion of the webinar. So what we're looking at here, where do you start? We talked about the Live Intensive. This is specific information. It's going to help you identify risk and take action. I've kind of talked about all these areas, and sorry, the text is pretty small here, but we're going to talk about legal structures and insurance, COPA and DMCA. We're going to talk a little bit about FTC issues, many other topics. But we're also going to demystify some common misunderstandings. We're going to compare services like LegalZoom to actual legal representation and even self-help. And there will be time for Q&A. So what do you get? This is one of the questions I get. Yeah, but what's the value? Well, I think the value, I actually don't feel that I need to sell the value, because my time alone, for what you are going to pay for the intensive, you would pay more to sit down with me. And I'll get to that in a second. But a couple of the value points. It's going to be the value of the time you spend on the intensive. It's going to be a value of mitigating potential liability, meaning you're actually reducing the risk of being liable for something legal in nature. It's going to be the value of putting additional money back in your pocket. And by that I mean, if you were able to save $10,000 that you would have otherwise had to have paid an attorney, because you did something right, because you took proactive action to mitigate legal risk, that's putting money back in your pocket. And also this value of peace of mind, because now you're not as worried about these legal issues. And remember, in one of the first slides, we talked about that the vast majority of businesses worry about lawsuits, frivolous, unfair, or otherwise. They're actually worried. So also bring an additional value point of giving you some level of peace of mind. Okay, so I want to just finalize this with, you get access to an attorney on these topics that we cover in the live intensive. Now, the live intensive is about 2 hours, and you can say, well, hey, Brock, you know, I can hire an attorney for 2 hours and maybe spend, you know, 700, 800 bucks. Why are you saying it's actually more than 2,500? Here's the reason why. This live intensive has been prepped for you. It's sort of a turnkey topical solution for you. It's not like, hey, I need to book 2 hours with my attorney, and you're asking questions, and you may or may not hit in the right direction with your questions. You may not have time to cover even the stuff you came in to ask. So with the topics we're going to cover, with the concise laser focus on these topics, really you're looking at a cost of in excess of $2,500. The other thing is, access to this type of information can actually save you more than $50. And that could be in the form of paying a defense attorney if you're sued, even if your case doesn't go to trial. You may have to pay in excess of $50,000 just to navigate towards a settlement of your case. Now, granted, additional access to these types of the residual benefits from this live intensive could save you in excess of $100,000. What I mean by that? Well, let me give you infringement. A single act of infringement could actually warrant damages against you of over $100,000. So you get sued because you used one image without permission. You get sued. You pay an attorney at least $50,000 to help defend you. And if there's a judgment against you, it could easily be over 100. But let's say that you don't want to pay that amount, so you settle early, so you pay $50,000. Well, guess what? That license may have only cost 100 bucks, 200 bucks, $500, and now you're looking at $150,000 out of pocket. If you don't have insurance, that could be the one thing that actually puts you out of business. So when I talk about value, this thing is packed with value. There's value, there's more value in all these different ways. What is the live intensive cost for you? 199 bucks. Why? Because I want to gather you into a place where I can speak to you all at once and explain these areas to you. So it's cost effective for me, and it makes me able to make it cost effective for you. Because obviously, if each of you scheduled some time with me to do live intensive for you one-on-one, you'd pay a lot more money. But I'm packing that value in, and honestly, I don't even need to sell that price, because at $199, I think the evidence is clear what that's going to do for you. So what are your jump back on screen, and we're going to finish this out. So you're going to click the offer, and the offer, it'll post in a second in the webinar, but this is what you're going to look like when you click on the offer. It's going to take you to a checkout page on my website, and this is on brockshinen.com. The website, it's going to show you Legal for Online Business Intensive Webinar, 199 bucks, and right below that, you're going to see a form that you fill out, your name, your address. You're going to create an account and pay the 199 bucks, and then you'll be sent the links to the live intensive, which we're currently scheduling for the last week of February. So you jump on there, and the reason why I'm showing you all this, let me get back on screen with you, is because I don't want you to be surprised, well, hey, this doesn't have any sales copy. I don't see any pictures, or this isn't a landing page that looks like it's designed to sell me. The reason why is because by the time you click on the offer, you should be sold. You should know the value you're getting. So I'm going to pop in this offer right here. You should actually see it load up. I'm going to display it. So I think you'll see it right now, right? And on the right-hand side, you'll see Legal for Online Business, Live Intensive, picture of me, and claim my spot. So once you click on that, you'll be taken to that page. Like I said, it's a checkout page. There's no sales copy. There's no, you know, already sold on the need for this thing. So jump in there, sign up. This will go away. This pricing, this availability for you on this webinar will go away, because I want it as a bonus to you. So click on that offer now. You can click on it, pay, make your set up your account, make your payment, jump back on. but I want to jump into a Q&A time for the rest of us. But do not miss that spot. Do not miss that intensive. You're really going to gain a substantial amount of benefit. Like I said, very specific to online business. These issues, there's going to be a laser focus. There's going to be action steps that you can take, and I'm just going to pack it in with value. So do not miss it. Okay, let's jump into a time of Q&A. So you're going to see on the right, like I said, a chat box. You can use that chat box to start asking questions, and we will go through those questions, and we'll see what we can knock out in a few minutes, and then we'll be done. And before we do that, I just want to say thank you so much for joining me on this webinar, The 3 Legal Traps for Online Business. Your time means the world to me, that you would spend it with me, that you would learn alongside me, and I hope that I can help you. If you need anything, reach out. You can reach me at Brock, B-R-O-C-K, at shinenlaw.com about representation, or if you have specific scenarios. Reach out, Brock, B-R-O-C-K, at shinenlaw.com, Brock at shinenlaw.com. Reserve your spot for the live intensive, and let's transition into a Q&A time.